Of all the things you can do to improve your effectiveness in learning a new language, there's one concept you can learn that will immediately change your approach and make all your efforts more successful. This one thing will completely change how you think about language and what it means to speak one. Hi, I'm Tony, a linguist and a PhD student, and I'm here to share with you what I know about language. Let's get into it. So in another video I made, linked here and in the description, I talked about how learning the sounds of a new language is the first best step you can take to learning the language as a whole. And some of the comments on that video uncovered a deeper idea here. That idea is this: a different language doesn't describe the same world differently. A different language describes a different world. Languages don't put the same material into different categories. They offer different categories to put different material in. And this is the one mindset shift that you need to increase the rate at which you learn the language and can speak it confidently. In this video, I'm going to talk about how this applies to different levels of language, and later I'll share one powerful strategy for how you can apply this to your language learning. First, let's get into some background on this concept. There's a common conception that languages are like packages for information. The same information goes in the package, no matter what the package looks like, and then that information comes out the other side to the listener. An idea that goes back millennia to Plato and his forms, and is still accepted by many strands of linguistics today, such as in the research done by Noam Chomsky and his followers. But the idea that a language doesn't just determine the packaging for the information, but affects the information itself, is an old one. One of the most famous and controversial proposals for how language shapes us, rather than just being a conduit for information to flow through, is the sapir-whorf hypothesis. Neither Sapir nor Whorf came up with the hypothesis, but each one thought about language in a way that gave rise to it. And the basic idea is that the language you speak affects the way you think. Now, there are two versions of this hypothesis. The strong one says that your language determines your thought, while the weak one says that the language you speak has some impact on the way you think. Other scholars have said something similar. Ludwig Wittgenstein, after spending the first part of his career arguing based on the assumption that language could represent some pre-existing reality or world, and that language could somehow be universally true, came to say, famously, that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And this fits with what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is also getting at. Jacques Derrida is another influential figure in the same vein. His deconstructionism rejects the notion that there are some truths already existing that can be expressed through language. When we use language, we aren't articulating some pre-existing thing or things. We're instead making meaning as we use the language. And what words and expressions actually mean can only be determined by how they're used in a given situation. So what does this mean for your language learning? The basic principle I want you to keep in mind is that signs, like language sounds, words, whole sentences, depend on categories in order to make meaning. But these categories shift, even on different occasions of speaking the same language. Important for learning a new language though, if these categories can shift even within the same language, between two different languages, they can be completely different. Let's start with how we can apply this to the sounds of language. Imagine there's a space of sounds that you can make with your mouth. This space is almost infinite, depending on where exactly your tongue is, and what you're doing with your throat, and whether you're pushing air out of your lungs or sucking air into them when you make the sound. This space is really big, but helpfully, there are particular points in this space where language sounds tend to exist. For example, the spot behind your top teeth, called the alveolar ridge, is a really important place for language. Here, thousands of languages make sounds like t and d. In English, these two sounds are represented by t and d. Another, less common place of articulation is between the teeth, such as in English th or the, as in thin or this. But just as there's almost an infinite number of ways to make sounds in the mouth, and we decide that placing the tongue in one spot is meaningful and another spot isn't, different languages determine whether or not two spots are meaningfully different or can be considered the same. Let's continue with this example. In English, we think of the sounds d and the as different sounds. What I mean is that we consider these sounds two different categories of sound. Though there are some dialects where they overlap some, these different types of sound can differentiate words. So we have words like day and they, or tide and tithe, or utter and other. In each pair, just one sound distinguishes the words from one another. But this isn't a necessary distinction. In Spanish, de and the are not two different sounds. Instead, they're two different ways of making the same sound. We can look at the word for tooth. This word can be said either with a de or a the and still be the same word. Diente and diente are the same word, not two different ones. There are important conditions on when you use one sound or the other, but we'll leave those aside here. This is just one example of how different languages divide up the sound space differently, but this is true for many sounds between almost any two languages. So here's what that means for language learning. When you're learning the sounds of a different language, you can't rely on the categories of your first language. Just because your native language differentiates two sounds, saying they're totally different things, doesn't mean that the language that you're learning isn't going to treat those sounds as two different ways to do the same thing. If we think back to the sound space, it's like cutting it up into different pieces. Each piece is meaningfully different from every other piece, but the cut can happen in different ways. Recognizing this, you can approach your new language open to the idea that what you're hearing may, and probably does, cut up the sound space differently than your native language does. The next major area where signs divide up the space differently is in words. First, we need to understand that the boundaries between things that we consider different are fuzzy. Let's take an example from English. We have two concepts, a cup and a bowl. It's pretty easy to see that one fits in one category, the things that are cups, and the other fits in another category, the things that are bowls. But we can also see that the line between the two categories isn't as clear as we think. The question is, what do you call this? Some might say it's a cup. Others will say it's a bowl. Some will say it's neither, or both. And here we thought these categories were so simple. When we use a word, we're describing a category of things, but these categories differ from language to language. We can look at an example from Russian. In languages from several families around the world, the colors green and blue are expressed differently from how we as English speakers might expect. In English, we have one term to cover this segment of the color spectrum, blue. Within this space, we might refer to one color as light blue, or sky blue, and the other dark blue, or navy blue, but they're all blue. But in Russian, there's no concept uniting these two parts of the color spectrum into one color. Instead of being two shades of a single color, they're two separate colors. This is голубой, and this is синий. This is just one example, but the insight for your language learning is much wider. Words in your native language don't always correspond one-to-one with the words in the language you're learning. The languages don't just talk about the same thing with different words. They create different things to talk about. And this concept applies to whole phrases or sentences as well. A couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine was telling me about speaking Spanish, and he put it to me like this. When you're learning a new language, you can't just put words of the new language into the slots of your native one. We can see this in how different languages talk about the concept of having a positive feeling towards something. In English, you say, I like it. We make the I active, the subject of the sentence, and we're required to use it to refer to whatever the thing is that we feel positively about. But consider how Spanish and Italian do it differently. In Spanish, you can say, me gusta, and in Italian, mi piace. The first big difference is that in Spanish and Italian, the thing that you feel positively about is the active member of the sentence. These phrases can be paraphrased in English as, it pleases me. And the second big difference is that you don't need the word for it here. It's understood and can be left out. The same concept, but two very different ways of talking about it. And let's dig into another example that uses Spanish and English. We're going to take a short sentence and see it in either language and see how they compare. In Spanish, you can say, le di su regalo. And in English, I gave him his gift. But notice how you can't just move the concepts or the words from one language to the other. The order in which you put them and the different meanings that the words carry with them have to change in order to sound natural. To him, I gave his gift might have worked well in English a long time ago, but now it's a strange way to express this idea. And in Spanish, it would be equally strange to say di a él su regalo. And there are at least two other differences between these phrases that show that you can't just take the concepts from one language and transfer them to the other. These differences are in le, or him, and su, or his. Let's start with le and him. In English, we have to specify with the word something about the person we're talking about. Him has to be used if we're talking about a boy or a man. But in Spanish, le is ambiguous. It doesn't give us any information about the gender of the person we're talking about. That is, it represents a broader range of concepts than the English him. And the same can be said of his. It specifies the gender of the person receiving the gift. But su doesn't. Su, on the other hand, specifies something about the gift that English doesn't. It specifies the number of the gifts being given. His is used when we're talking about his gift or his gifts, but su can only be used with his gift, or her gift, or their gift, while more than one gift would require sus regalos. And if you're a native Spanish speaker speaking English, you might sometimes find yourself using his when you meant her, and vice versa. You might want to say something about a man and his wife, but you end up saying a man and her wife. This is because in Spanish, what su looks like is determined by what follows it. But in English, his and her are determined by what comes before them. The way phrases and sentences are put together differs from one language to another. And this is something you should be applying as you learn to speak other languages. So how can you make this concept work for you? A powerful strategy is to practice shutting off your preconceived notions about what things in the world are similar and what things are different. You can do this when you're speaking your new language, but you can also do this when you're speaking your native language, or when you're not speaking at all. Start noticing the connections that aren't necessary among the things that you take for granted. Take apart concepts and imagine how they could be talked about differently and conceived of differently. A good place to start is idioms. We take them to mean what they mean without thinking too much of it. Think, for example, of getting off on the wrong foot, meaning starting a relationship with someone poorly. There are loads of other ways that this concept could have come to be talked about. You could imagine the phrase being something like starting off shaking the wrong hand, or beginning the journey in the wrong direction. But we arbitrarily use getting off on the wrong foot instead. Another idiom is cooking the books, meaning changing financial records to make them look better than they actually are. You can think of a dozen different ways this idiom might have been. But let's focus on the word books. Is a book in accounting really the same thing as a book that you might read? Not necessarily. If you talk about the books in other languages, referring to accounting documents, you'll end up with a lot of confused looks. In Spanish, for example, it would be las cuentas, the accounts. And you can keep going with applying this technique. Ask why in English it's weird to say, "To him I gave the gift." Couldn't it have been that way? One answer you might come up with is that we have a different way of emphasizing him when we talk about who we gave the gift to. We stress the word and say, "I gave the gift to him," which is different from "I gave the gift to him." Start doing this on a regular basis, and you'll start to expand the way that you're thinking about how things really are in the world, and how these things are reflected in language. This shift in our understanding of what language is can open doors for us when we're learning other languages. But think a second about this. Switching off your preconceptions about how the world is organized won't only help you learn a language faster, it'll allow you to see the world from another perspective. And this can have a much larger effect on who you are and what you take reality to be. But that's a conversation that's going to have to wait for another time. We'll see you in the next one.